This is George Lucas, and welcome to the audio commentary. This really is conceived as a 6-part movie, of which episode 1 is the first chapter. And sometimes it's difficult to keep that in mind, that each film, while it's important in itself and relates to what's going on in that film and has to be entertaining in itself, really is fitting into a larger mosaic, and that the whole enterprise won't really be understood, I think, until you can actually sit down and watch all 6 episodes and then follow the story, because we're dealing in micro stories here. The larger picture is kind of a different story.
God, I'll never forget the first time I sat in a theater with George Lucas and we saw the opening credits. It was a very moving experience for me, working on my first episode with all the history that went with it and all the responsibility. It was a major event for me personally.
I remember the very first roll-up they filmed at ILM on the first movie. The typing was actually set out on the floor, and the camera on a track actually did a huge crane shot over the backlit words. It was not done by computer as it's done today, and I can remember the difficulty they had getting it to move smoothly. And the roll-up would start fast, then go slow, then speed up again, then go slow, and it was impossible to watch at that point until they worked it out and had it all at uniform speed.
Structurally, all the movies start exactly the same way, go from titles pan down to a ship or to a planet or to something. But we have a fairly stringent stylistic design to these things, so they all work exactly the same. The films are designed to be primarily like silent films, and the dialogue and the effects and everything are just part of the musical composition to tell the story visually rather than through a lot of heavy dialogue.
All the ships in this scene here, the Neimoidian battleships and the blockade, are still photos mapped onto cards.
Most of the sounds in a film like this are not electronic in nature, but rather they're acoustic. They're real sounds that come from the world around us, things that I might hear in everyday life. And it's these everyday ordinary sounds, carefully chosen and orchestrated, which give the film its credibility.
The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. You know, I'll tell a story in one way and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly. This is a thematic note that continues through all the movies. It's a kind of jokey one, but there's a lot more that are more on the serious side. But it really is designed as a piece of music where you have a melodic, thematic device that is used over and over again.
In a film like this, because of production noises on the set and the inappropriate surfaces they may walk on that might the footsteps might have a wooden sound, the original tracks are pretty much thrown away, and about 85% of the dialogue is replaced later after the film has been edited. The actors are brought back in and they do their lines over again while listening to the cue track from the original shooting session. At one point I dubbed the 2 Neimoidians with ESPN sports announcers. It was kind of a very funny juxtaposition of that kind of voice with their alien characters. It didn't work, but it was funny. It was one of the many experiments used to develop the Neimoidian voices.
These kind of scenes on this particular film on the bridge were kind of interesting. It's the first time we actually shot with no set, and it was very interesting to try to figure out how we were going to put all this together, because all I really had was the 2 Neimoidians there and a door, and everything else was done in blue screen or in miniature.
The motors you hear on the robot here, which are the same motors used in C-3PO, are actually from a 1969 Cadillac Eldorado door motor, the motor used for the windows to go up and down.
Again, I wanted the recurring theme of the protocol droid, and I wanted to make sure people realized it wasn't 3PO, but that we always have protocol droids in the movies to remind you of 3PO's true role in all this. Introducing Darth Sidious as a hologram was the way he was introduced actually in Empire Strikes Back, which is the first time we actually saw him in the first 3 films. So I thought it appropriate to keep that thematic device going, is only know him as a hologram and not actually deal with him, except in one small scene as a real person, because I did want to make sure that you knew that he wasn't just a hologram and making him sort of flesh and blood.
One of the interesting things about this scene is it contains one of the only non-visual effect shots that we have in the whole movie, and I'll give you a clue. It's the ventilation shaft. We did that at ILM about a year and a half after we shot the actual sequence.
When we have the droids here, it was important to establish these droids as slightly goofy rather than ominous, and not very good shots, and they have absolutely no defense against a Jedi and a laser sword. They're just hopeless. So the idea was that as we go on, that the problem of developing better combat technology is established in this movie, and then it will be dealt with further in Episode 2. Means of a robotic army in terms of their all being controlled by one source and not being as swift as a human is a theme that we play out through all the movies. It's important in the beginning here of the film to establish that the Jedi were invincible. I've kind of reversed the classic monster coming through the door motif, where you make it where the aliens and the droids and all the villains are faced with these two invincible creatures, Jedi Godzillas that nothing can stop. I kind of enjoyed the idea of making the good guys invincible and the bad guys cowering in fear. They obviously come up against some force that off the ship, and we use the wheels to do that.
Features for the wheel droids, you may notice it's a sound. It sounds like a horn beeping in there, but it was actually a sound recorded during Empire Strikes Back. There was an air gun on the set which fired bits of metal through the air when Darth Vader and Luke were fighting in the carbon freezing chamber, and that special effects gun on the set made kind of a sound like a little horn. And I took the very beginnings of that sound and used it to make the lasers for the wheel droids. So sounds get recycled. Some things recorded 20 years ago, if they haven't been used yet, they often get listened to again as we search for components for usually something of the nature of 1,000 recording projects for the sound effects in each film.
This movie is told primarily from the Jedi's point of view, but the story that's being told is essentially the story of Queen Amidala and her plight of having her planet blockaded, as in, say, Episode 4, where the story is told through the eyes of the droids, and this one is told through the eyes of the Jedi.
The sound of her view screen tuning was a kind of a fun homage. There was a sound I loved as a kid in the old Flash Gordon serials for the view screens being tuned. I could never figure out what that sound was. It had kind of an electronic tone to it. Of course, I knew in the early 1930s they didn't have the ability to generate a sound effect that way. And I thought about it a lot, and eventually I reasoned that it must have been a musical instrument. And a bit of research turned up a flute, which Gary Rydstrom's wife, Cindy, can play. Her flute, exactly the same note as we heard in those old movies. And I was really surprised to find out that it was exactly the sound I was looking for.
This shot represented a turning point for everyone working at ILM and everyone in the post-production editorial process. It was such a beautiful, breathtaking painting. And it was the first time that all of us could actually see the depth and wealth of talent that was going into a shot. It was monumental to be able to see something so provocative and so beautiful as Naboo like that, because we had been working for so long and so hard, and we had not really seen a painting that had come out of ILM for a long time.
When I decided to create the planet of Naboo, I really wanted to create a planet that was timeless, but at the same time reminiscent of classic Roman Renaissance architecture. So we shot in Italy and used a lot of Italian influences on this to create an environment that was not based on technology, but based on beauty and a whole different mindset from the more technological cultures like Coruscant.
These ships, the sound of these ships were fashioned from a helicopter. The sound of an idling helicopter slowed down a great deal. Had some nice tone qualities to it, as well as a deep rhythmic sound.
This is a very large model we built, probably about 5 feet long, that is shot against the blue screen that's going behind these trees. These trees, I think, are a photograph we actually had taken during the making of Star Wars that we used for the background of that shot. And even some of these backgrounds here were slides that we had taken during the first Star Wars that we're reusing. These are, this is the big landing sequence where we just tried to make it as big as we could with all sorts of interesting looking vehicles coming out and different scale